day to everyone. I think I know many, if not most of you. I am Jonathan Young from Loch Lord, and I co-chair this group along with Chris Armstrong, Alexandra Schluck-Amend, and our new colleague who has joined us in the co-chair, Smitha Menon. And I think I've shared this general thought with most of you, but just given that there are some new faces on the call, I'll reiterate it. I think this particular practice group is a very useful one for World Law Group, in that as lawyers who full-time or part-time or occasionally touch restructuring issues, we just by definition end up interfacing with all the other parts of our firms, our respective firms. I'm sure it's that way for each of you to some extent. And I usually in the course of a day find myself speaking with 5 or 6 different practice group members at my firm, often in 3 or 4 different geographies. So I just think the nature of this practice lends itself to collaboration across practice groups, across cities. And that's useful, of course, in World Law Group, because I think what all of us are trying to do here, and in addition to building, our community, is to find opportunities to work together on inbound and outbound matters. And the more people at your firms the more people with whom you collaborate, the greater the opportunity for that to happen. So we're a relatively new-ish group. Hannah, I don't know, is this year 3?
I think it was 2019, Jonathan.
So I think we're still building the group, but I think we've been very pleased with the level of participation. And as evidenced by this meeting, we continue to have new colleagues join. So very glad you're all here. And we try to really make this useful and come up with content that's going to be relevant and timely. And we really encourage you, both on these meetings and also offline, to let us know what interests you, what are the topics you find relevant in your respective jurisdictions, what are the sorts of projects you want to see this group undertake. We have a lot of opportunity and resources within World Law Group to create content, whether through podcasts or webinars or written texts or things we post to the website. We're still building out the functionality of communicating through the group, but I think it's good and it's going to get better. And I think part of the whole goal here is for all of us to be in conversation about what's happening in our respective jurisdictions. So let me pause there. And Smitha, I didn't mean to ambush you, but I was thinking, just because this is your first meeting in the co-chair role, it might be nice and helpful if you gave a little bit of an introduction on yourself and your practice and some of the things that interest you in terms of what this practice group might do.
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. I'm Smitha. I'm from Singapore. I'm in Wong Partnership, which is one of what we call the Big 4 firms. The way the Singapore legal market's organized, there's essentially 4 big firms and a few medium-sized firms, but the bulk of the market are small sole proprietorships or firms that are less than 5 people. So essentially, that's how the market works. And in my firm, what we do is our restructuring and insolvency practice is very tied to our corporate practice because we're more of a transactional firm. So compared to the other 3 firms in the market, their restructuring practices tend to be a bit more litigation based, and that's traditionally how it works in Singapore, because our restructuring law was only recently amended a few years ago, and before that we were very much an insolvency jurisdiction. So liquidations, creditor recovery, and that was really historically because Singapore was trying to be a financial center, and so it was very pro banks. But after we matured as a financial center, we've amended our law to move it more towards the Chapter 11 Canadian sort of bankruptcy legislation rescue culture. So with that, there's just a lot more opportunities for interesting work, because we do now debt restructuring is a big thing that we do in Singapore. And so a large part of my practice is acting for debtors. We do sometimes act for creditors, but that's only if it's creditors who want to sort of take over the group. So for example, in Noble, we acted for the ad hoc group of creditors that basically wanted to then take over the Noble group in a debt for equity swap. So that's essentially the nature of my practice. The only other interesting thing about my practice is I personally have another portfolio. I'm also an arbitration lawyer, and I'm the Singapore court member on the ICC Court of Arbitration. So on the arbitration front, I'm a representative there as well. All right, I will stop here in case anyone has any questions.
That's wonderful, Smitha. And I think the litigation or arbitration overlay on your practice is really useful, and one that I think many of us, myself included, really have pursued over time. Certainly in the U.S. market, we joke with our litigation colleagues, we have all the benefits of trial practice and none of the headaches. Once that first subpoena or deposition notice comes in, we can bring in help and move on to the next thing. But I think we all are by definition. Both deal lawyers and contentious lawyers. So I think that's terrific. I have one other question, just generally about the Singapore practice, and I know it's cyclical, and I know for all of us, the answer to this question changes every year. But when you look at where your cross-border matters are occurring, and sort of where your inbounds and outbounds are located, what are you seeing the past couple of years?
Okay, actually, I should have said this. Everything we do is cross-border, because there's never any, Singapore's so small as in terms of our own domestic economy. So you rarely have insolvencies or restructurings or even disputes that are purely Singaporean. What Singapore is a hub for financial services. So a lot of debt is raised in Singapore. So what we typically have is, it would be a foreign company that has, let's say it's an Indonesian company with operations in Indonesia and China and Malaysia, but they would have set up an entity in Singapore to raise debt, either a structure, not so much for tax reasons, but to issue bonds or to borrow from the bank. So all the international banks are in Singapore, and that includes Asian banks as well as European banks, not just American banks. So that's really where the Singapore angle is. But conversely, this would be more interesting for you guys, it's always cross-border. So over the last few years, it ranges depending on industry. This year, it's been all about crypto. So a lot of BVI companies, BVI-based companies. Previous years, it was the offshore marine and maritime sector. So the commodities trading and shipping sectors, and that involved mostly Asian companies. So you would, as well as some Norwegian entities. And before that was the construction industry. So it is cross-border, but most of it tends to be ASEAN. And where we see European companies, the cross-border element, European companies come into play, is really where it's European companies that have ventured out. So they've got operations or investments somewhere in India, Indonesia, China, Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand. So really it's companies that are looking to have something in Asia, some sort of investment in Asia. Chances are 9 out of 10 times they would have done a structure through Singapore.
Great, thank you. Well, that might be a good pivot for us. One of the things I was hoping we could talk about, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order just because it follows so nicely from what you said, Smitha, but I wanted to talk about just in each of our jurisdictions, what you're all seeing in the debt markets and kind of the larger economy, and then what are the vulnerable sectors. And maybe we could flip it. I just would be very interested in kind of hearing in your different jurisdictions, what are the sectors where you're seeing trouble or the beginnings of trouble? And, Rosa, by all means, jump in after me and give your thoughts on what you're seeing, in your US-based matters. But, it's interesting, and it's been written on a lot that, of course, there were a lot of opportunities for the stay-at-home industries. The tech companies that were streaming content, Peloton, selling everybody these beautiful, expensive bikes. And, conversely, and I should also add, all the, real durable goods and electronics equipment and just sort of nice things people could buy for their homes while they were all locked down. And, conversely, a lot of trouble for more experiential industries, like, for example, travel and hospitality, movie theaters, being a great example. And, of course, restaurants, really taking maybe the largest brunt of it. It's been interesting as we've moved into this next phase to see which companies are, struggling and which aren't. So Peloton just fascinates me just because I think the whole thing is such an interesting social experiment, but they're obviously in terrible trouble, incredibly sort of over-levered and underperforming. And, it was interesting also because apparently when they took off and when the economy really went into shutdown, they really presumed in their business model that it would stay that way indefinitely. And of course it hasn't. And of course, everybody has ended up being very excited to go back to the gym. So I don't know what's going to happen with them. I mean, it's sort of a business model that was built around getting people to buy the bike. And now it's a business model they're trying to build on subscriptions. So they're in trouble. But, you would have thought movie theaters might have pulled out of the nosedive, and they seem to be one of the, that entertainment sector seems to be one of the, real vulnerable ones, just in terms of some of the recent activity. I mean, I think the number 2 operators in a proceeding, and number 1's not looking so great. Restaurants seem to be doing a little better. Hospitality seems to be doing a little better. Energy just is so unpredictable and so driven by pricing, hard to predict. But we really have not seen the next big wave of cases in the US. We are seeing the more vulnerable players in all industries start to wobble a bit. And I mean, I think the most vulnerable industries are the ones with big, trailing, sort of big funded debt problems that are underperforming, whatever's the necessary level of net income to stay afloat. And I mean, I think we've all been really looking for real estate to be the next big problem, just because there's so much real estate debt and such a large number of non-performing or underperforming properties. But again, it's wobbling, but it hasn't really fallen yet. Rosa, that was, by definition, kind of anecdotal to me. What would you add or take away from that?
No, I mean, I agree with everything you said. I think you obviously covered a lot of things. I do think, as you mentioned with the movie theater, I mean, there are some things like movie theaters, but also quick service restaurants and things that that it's still a little unclear, like as the world comes back, exactly how people are going to be living their lives. And at least near me in downtown Washington, D.C., I think because people are in this hybrid model, and so working from home some days and in the office, a lot of the quick service restaurants have also closed. Whether, some of them are obviously small mom and pops and don't lead to big bankruptcies, but some of them have been large chains too. And so, it'll be interesting to see how that model operates. At my firm, we're sort of getting more in full swing now, like this month, than we have been. So I think as that sort of comes out, that'll be sort of, it'll begin to sort of shake out how this will look. And then the only other thing I would add to what you said is sort of just again about sort of the way we live our lives. So at least in DC, we're seeing people aren't getting on the metro anymore. And so the question is going to be, how is, public transportation that also has an infrastructure that's been set up. So a lot of people are driving to work who never used to. And it may be that they in a few months sort of switch their routine. But if that doesn't happen, right, our sort of cities are built on, and they have lots of bonds and debt and creditors. And it's a little early to tell for sure how that'll play out, but.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of that. Trolls, could we come to you? Any thoughts on what industries you're seeing as vulnerable?
Well, in Scandinavia, I think you can supply me with information from Finland, Paulina, but at least in Denmark, we see the construction and building industry struggling. A number of entrepreneurs, fairly large ones, have gone under over the last couple of months, and I think we see the beginning of more work in that area very shortly. The interest rates are going up, the heating bills are going up, everything is going up around that, and then we have some specific tax issues, which is actually accelerating the down pricing and the value of real estate. So that's at least one area. And then due to all the issues about energy prices, we have some, it's not a specific industry actually, but some of the larger corporations who are using a lot of energy, they're facing a hard time. So, but whether it will be so hard for them that they will actually need assistance in recovery, it's hard to tell at this point in time. So I think basically the whole travel industry and hotels, restaurants, and all that has picked up quite quickly. So that's I don't see that as a big issue here. But I think the picture painted about real estate is, as far as I'm concerned, the same in Sweden. I'm not quite certain about how it's working in Norway. They have they're floating cash normally, so I think they will be better off. But and Finland, that's Paulina's area and over there.
Paulina, can we come to you? What are you saying?
So hello from Finland also. Well, I think that so far we have not seen any huge problems in real estate and real estate sector. Our problems are in energy sector, and then airlines, and especially one of our own. And then also the companies that have had huge business in Russia, and now they have been exited from Russia. So not really huge problems, but you can see that when you are calculating all these together, then there might be a busy days for insolvency and restructuring lawyers, but not yet. It's still quite slow, I would say.
Question to both of you. To what extent do you see companies with resources hedging their price exposure on energy? I mean, how much are the futures or derivatives markets a tool to manage these risks?
well, I would say that that's exactly the problem at the moment, because you have to provide the securities and it has to be in cash. And that is sort of the reason for all the problems that the energy companies are having at the moment.
I see.
So the hedging is the sort of a cause of the problem.
Right. Any different for you, trolls?
Well, the Danish government just came up with a plan of financing the energy sector with about 100 billion Danish kroners, which is, what's that equivalent to? The dollar is about 8, so divided by 8. But it's so that is a huge problem, and that would be increasing problem going forward since the winter is coming, and the whole energy issue in Europe is very unstable. And I think it's a little bit, it's different in each country, because the different European countries are supplying themselves with different kinds of energy. But at least in Denmark, we have the issue that they closed down the gas production a year ago in order to have some remodeling and things done in the different areas out in the North Sea, and that has been postponed, so they won't open until next year. So I think we are heading for problems there, definitely.
How do the Scandinavian countries do with renewables or nuclear or alternate sources?
Well, I think you have 2 countries with nuclear, which is Finland and to a less extent Sweden. But Sweden and Norway are basically doing well with the gas, and Norwegians have a lot of gas, and they also have energy from the water in both countries. So I think those countries are doing fine. They would be exporting energy over the next winter time, but we still have to import it, and I don't know how that's looking in Finland. But it's all connected. All the energy distribution networks in Europe are connected. So you will get gas and from all different sources along the way. So we might be in a position where we would have to rely on getting gas from Germany, and Germany doesn't have enough gas. So it's going to be an interesting and maybe a little bit of cold time. I don't know.
I hope not. Hope it's a mild winter.
Yeah, that's true.
Just before we move along, just a quick thought about hospitality and I guess travel and leisure generally. I've started to travel a lot more actually the past several months, and I don't know if this has been all of your experience, but I can't believe how expensive hotels have become, just everywhere. And it's hard for me to believe, with these price increases, that they seem to be sustaining, that they're not going to do okay. But I guess that presumes everybody continues traveling. Have you all, thanks, Hannah. I mean, have you all seen anything different? I mean, it's a pretty noticeable bump in the States.
Well, I think that in Europe, I think it's more the pricing of the airline tickets. They have sort of doubled within the last half year. Hotel prices have been going up as well, but I think it's just a fluctuation in the market. When everybody starts traveling normally again, I think it was eventually settled at a lower level.
Yeah, no, here's hoping. Tom, can I come to you just in terms of sectors you're seeing that are a little wobbly and where the trouble lies?
Where does the trouble lie in the UK? It's fair to say you may have noticed the UK is in a bit of a state of flux in the last week or so. Change of head of state, change of head of government. I was going to say, are either a change for the better. There's crises left, right, and centre here. The Bank of England is predicting a 15-month recession. We are seeing the highest spike in energy prices in Europe, despite having no reliance whatsoever on Russian or Ukrainian gas. I think part of that is another part of the old Brexit dividend, that we're no longer part of the common energy market. So although we get a lot from Norway, Norway is actually obliged to sell it to Europe, to the EU first before us. So energy is a real problem on a domestic and business level. A lot of the larger businesses, as have been suggested, have hedged, so they bought a lot in advance, so that the larger manufacturers, for example, will be fine for a bit. But with a 15-month recession looming and no sign of real resolution to the energy crisis, that's a deferred problem. With consumers, there's a lot of talk of people having to choose whether to heat or eat this winter, which in a rather developed economy is pretty shocking stuff. Thursday, the government suggested there's going to be a price cap to help for consumers and maybe for some businesses. Details are unclear before the news was shelved for this week's news. So there's a lot of looming crises there. And even before the energy issues, there were a lot of looming crises. There's obviously the global supply chain crisis, COVID. There's an awful lot of businesses with the balance sheets in real trouble. So usually they'd be able to, go through their reserves to get through this winter. But the reserves of a lot of businesses have been exhausted over the pandemic. And then I say we've got Brexit as well. There's a lot of businesses struggling with import, struggling with export. The supply chain issues are particularly acute on that front, and the labour market is in an awful lot of trouble. There is no capacity in the labour market. We've got huge numbers of jobs vacancies at the moment, which is very odd going into a recession. But that's simply because we've made it clear that to a number of millions in our workforce, our government's made it clear that they're not allowed in. They're not particularly welcome. So we've got labour crises in hospitality. We've got labour crises in the care sector, in the construction sector. Agriculture's really struggling. There's reports of food rotting in the fields. So it's not quite a sceptred isle at the moment. And yet, I'm not seeing a huge pickup in work yet. We've been talking for quite some time, that the tide is out. We're ready for this tidal wave to come in, and it hasn't come in yet. And the longer it's out for, the worry is it's going to be bigger and bigger. We have seen spikes in insolvencies, but only in liquidations. The quick burial liquidations of companies that are either zombie companies that should have gone bust years ago, because we've been running at 50% below the natural rate of insolvencies for the last 2 years, or those who simply haven't taken advice and have just run out of options. So none of that gives a lot of work for the lawyers. But we are expecting a busy final quarter of the year as all of these crises come together and seem particularly acute over here. How are we seeing it? We're seeing it in construction. Construction's often the canary in the coal mine. It's the larger, there's a lot of large contracts that were entered into a couple of years ago. So the projects are ongoing, but it's the subcontractors who are really starting to struggle and tip over because they're on fixed price contracts from 2 years ago when we're running at 10%, 12% inflation. And the labour market has dried up. It also tends to be a fairly aggressive industry when it comes to debt collection. The care sector, particularly the residential elderly care sector, I'm doing some work in that at the moment. And that's obviously been hit badly by COVID. A lot of it relies on local government funding. Local government funding has been cut repeatedly over the last 12 years. Obviously, they need to keep the care homes pretty warm over winter, so there's a real problem there. And they really struggle with staffing, having lost Eastern European staffing and lost a lot of people to bar work. Because bar and restaurant work now, because of the labour shortage from the Eastern European labour leaving, now pays as much as medical care for dementia patients. So they're understandably losing a lot there. So that's a real struggle. There's a lot of US investors in the care sector. There's a lot of REITs have bought up a few years ago, thinking there may be some profit to be made. There isn't. And we've also seen quite a lot of e-commerce as well. Obviously e-commerce, as you're saying at the outset, Jonathan, was flying during the pandemic as everybody abandoned the high street or main street, and bricks and mortar retailers were really struggling. Now people have gone back to town and going back to using physical shops, particularly with the supply chain crisis, meaning you can't guarantee an online order will arrive ever at the moment. So people like to go back to the shops. And those headwinds around the supply chain, around inflation, around tight consumer spend, and consumer spending really becoming a little more discriminating at the moment, are hitting e-retailers. So we're seeing a lot of those being buffered by the same weather that buffer the bricks and mortar. So there's a lot going on underneath the surface. Not a lot of that is flowing through to major restructuring and insolvency work yet, but we're
Thank
holding
you.
our breath.
No, thank you. That was excellent. And I mean, look, we all talk about just the geopolitical issues and the bearing they have on what we do and the health of these companies. And I mean, I think it's a pretty major event in the life of the United Kingdom to swap prime ministers and to see the Queen pass on. I mean, it's just, I can't even imagine what a tumultuous time it must be right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was 24 years old before I'd seen 4 prime ministers. My son is 6 and he's on his 4th. So it's interesting times. And Brexit was really a grenade under the constitution, which has been torn to shreds in the years since. It doesn't feel like a nation on the up at the moment, it is fair to say.
Well, better days soon, I hope.
Fingers crossed.
Jean-Luc, nice to see you, and I wonder if we could come to you next.
Yeah, nice to see you all. So just a brief word of introduction. I'm a colleague of Alexandra, but from Belgium, actually. And I work in the insolvency department, but in Belgium, the insolvency team is included in the corporate litigation team. So basically, I also deal with corporate litigation, which makes a lot of sense from my perspective, because in Belgium, I would say that the vast majority of insolvencies includes at some point the involvement of a court. So basically it makes sense. And to get back to your question regarding the sectors that could be struggling pretty soon, or that are struggling already. In fact, in Belgium, it's quite odd. Because there at this stage, let's say today, the last quarter, there has been a fair amount of insolvency, but not that much. I mean, insolvency practitioners were expecting dramatic figures, and it did not happen. I don't have any explanation, but I guess that it's partially due to the legal moratorium that the Belgian government put in place for, I think it was almost 2 years. So I think it helped a lot. That's, let's say, my first explanation, which is not the official one, but my first explanations. And the second one would be maybe that also there is a temporary framework to place an emphasis on out-of-court restructuring. So basically, I'm not aware of any restructuring happening because it's basically secret, and I think it helped as well. I know a few big names, I mean, in Belgium, that used that kind of frameworks to help them to be well, in fact. And to give you a couple of examples, but it's pretty much the same in other European countries. I think the construction sector is quite struggling in Belgium, but not that much. I mean, officially not that much. There have been quite huge restructurings for supermarket chains. and also restaurants chains, basically. I mean, in my view, there are the three main sectors officially struggling, and I know there are others, but at this stage, as I said, it's not yet a problem. But the thing is that at the end of the year, there will be most likely issues with electricity bills. So we'll see what happens next. It's quite unpredictable, I think.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a great overview, and certainly some concerning trends. I mean, what are you seeing just anecdotally when you go out to eat? How full are the restaurants?
I mean, in the field, in that field, it's quite difficult, but I would say there are two main categories. You have the traditional restaurant, like I would say there is one at the end of my street, which is really already struggling with his electricity bills, but it's quite maintaining with, I think, the legal moratorium that was, I think it ended, I think it was more or less 6 months ago, so it's quite recent. And I think it helped a lot. And you have this huge corporations, the big chains, they are not so agile. So it's quite, we see that it's quite difficult for them to innovate, or just to, there is I don't know if you know the name, Le Pain Quotidien. I don't know if you've heard the restaurant chain, so Le Pain Quotidien. It's a Belgian chains, and basically they use the main framework in Belgium, which is the judicial reorganization. And basically, and it was obvious, they had real difficulties to innovate. It was basically the same menu, and it still is, unfortunately, but since 20 years. So basically, pretty much the same structure, heavy structure, with an increasing trend to expand. I think in the US, in Canada, in Asia, and at the end of the day, it kind of collapsed, basically, because of this huge structure, difficult to adapt to another economy, to a fierce competition as well. So basically, there are, I would say, two kind of restaurants.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. Liam, could we come to you?
Yeah, absolutely, guys. So Cayman BVI is similar to Singapore. Everything we're doing is cross-border. People use Cayman entities to access those sort of Western debt and equity markets. Post-COVID, we expected to see a whole sort of avalanche of debt restructuring. That never really materialized. I think because there was so much sort of cheap money in the system, but all of that seems to be drying up. So what we've been seeing in sort of recent weeks and months is, the SPAC market's fallen through the floor. That sort of readily available capital is no longer there. So, and with it, sort of company valuations are going down. We're seeing a lot of sort of down rounds where, companies are having to raise money because either they're going to run out of money, they're early stage companies, or just in order to meet their sort of, their growth plans. It's all premised on raising capital at certain intervals. It's now very, very difficult and much more expensive to raise that capital. So a lot of the valuations now will be obviously raising funds at lower valuations than in previous rounds, which is causing tension between different classes of shareholders. People are also more selective with how they're investing their dollars. So historically, we'd see people have greater appetite for risk. All of that seems to be, heading towards a more conservative outlook. So those that have invested previously are no longer willing to invest going forward. Certainly in respect of early stage growth companies, crypto in particular. So I assume a lot of people invested in crypto, you know, sort of pre-ICO stage, looking at some of these valuations once they got to the stage of, you know, issuing these coins, they're no longer willing to sort of keep pumping money into it because, you know, the sort of end of project revenues are no longer what they once used to be. So we're having a lot of those sort of discussions with people who are just running out of money. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, so the last couple of months. But we're seeing a lot of sort of voluntary liquidations or insolvent liquidations. Directors are getting very sort of nervous in terms of, we're not going to run out of money tomorrow, but we're going to run out of money in 4 to 6 months' time. And unless our seed investors put more money in, then we're just going to have to wind it all down rather than keep borrowing money, knowing that, you know, you're just kicking the can down the road. So we're seeing a lot of that sort of work. The Chinese property debt restructuring market is still there. All that debt's, most of it goes to the Cayman Islands. All of it needs to be restructured. We thought we were going to get an avalanche of this work sort of at the end, sort of turn of this year. Nothing's happened. So, which is strange. But the general view seems to be that we obviously deal with the offshore debt. All of the onshore debt tends to be owned by Chinese state-owned enterprises or state-owned banks, which means nothing's coming offshore until they deal with the onshore and all of your sort of retail lenders. But it's been very quiet. It doesn't seem to be moving. Certain of those companies seem to be getting closer to a consensual agreement, but nothing's really getting over the line yet. In terms of sort of geographical regions, historically, we've always had a lot of that PRC debt work since the early 90s. We're now seeing a lot more Middle Eastern and LATAM in particular.
Thank you. That was excellent, and you covered just a bunch of different things. Quick question with regard to, you know, what I'll call the PRC originated property or real estate debt. I know there hasn't been anything remotely approaching a solution or a restructuring. I'm just curious if you know, is it performing, most of it? I know the properties aren't, but is the debt getting serviced?
For the large part, no. There's a couple of sort of exceptions where small payments have been made. But no, it's always on the promise that they're going to restructure everything and roll it up. And it tends to be, by the look of it, debt for debt. So all they're doing is kicking the can down the road. They're going to restructure that debt and just push the dates out. And it's very difficult for these sort of note holder groups or the creditor groups. They don't really have much influence or power because all of that debt's pretty much controlled, and the companies are controlled by state-owned enterprises.
Interesting. Second thing you touched on was crypto.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I didn't mention it in my initial review of what's going on in the US, and there really hasn't been a wave, but I think it's a sector we're all keeping a close eye on. And we have a case that was filed in the Southern District of New York called Celsius, that I think is, you know, the amounts at issue and the parties involved and just sort of the timing and positioning of the case is such that I think we're going to get answers to some pretty interesting open questions under US insolvency law. And specifically, you know, the fascinating question in crypto for all of us is, what's the nature of the claim held by the account holders? I mean, are they like, is it like a brokerage? Do they have a property interest in the funds? Are they just unsecured claim holders against sort of an underfunded account? I just think this is a case where the amounts are sufficiently large, we're going to get answers. And I think the law in the US is fairly underdeveloped on this topic. I mean, there are analogous precedents, but not in crypto. So I think that piece is quite interesting. And the final thing I wanted to tie off on what you said, and I think we can do this relatively quickly, but we had just had a note on the agenda generally about debt market and deal market conditions. And I think you gave an awesome overview of that. Very similar to what I'm seeing. I mean, I think there's still new debt issuance. I think there's still deals being done. I just think it's tighter and it's priced more conservatively. And the money's flowing, but slower and more expensively. And you know, when we get to the point where just there's a large wave of defaults, could that be Q4? Could that be Q1 or 2? I don't know. It just feels generally like it's getting tighter. And I wondered if anybody in the meeting has seen anything more encouraging or less encouraging, or if that's pretty much a consensus view. Smitha, any different in Singapore?
No, I mean, you mentioned Celsius. I mean, we had I think this is all interconnected because ZipMax was also filed in Singapore, and that was a result of the exposure to Celsius. So I think what we're seeing here is how the knock-on effect of the companies that are based in Singapore, at least had a presence in Singapore as a result of crypto. We've seen a few of that. So we're acting with Tenyo for Three Arrows Capital. And that was one example of the knock-on effect on some other sub-funds and related parties that are also facing distress. So I think the crypto story, I didn't have an answer to your question for that one, but I think the crypto story is just unfolding and it'll be a bit more. But from what I'm seeing, I don't see any scope to restructure. It's just all looks like liquidation. Just realizing it's just closing out the positions and I think one of the things we've seen is that there's a real practical question of how do you take custody of the assets, because and maybe Liam is a better person to answer this, but the impression I get from the liquidators, especially those in the BVI, is that there is some hesitation to take on the risk of taking custody of the wallets. So that is a practical issue we're seeing here. I don't know if there's a solution to that in Europe or in America, but that's something we've seen, and nobody wants to take custody and be responsible, because once you've got the passcodes, that's it. It's your problem. And if something goes wrong, that's like millions of dollars. That's, yeah. Sorry, I digress from your question. I just wanted, since you passed the mic to me, I just want to bring up the point about crypto.
And the point I'd add on that as well, Jonathan, so is these crypto assets, when the liquidators are taking control of them, are highly volatile. So we've seen certainly on Three Arrows, some of the coins that they will hold, some of them have doubled their price within a very short period of time, 6 to 8 weeks. Some of them have gone down in value. They could equally go down. The whole nature of the Three Arrows liquidation itself has sort of increased the volatility in the market. So it's a victim of its, of its own actions. And what I would say is Three Arrows is a very large liquidation. We see a lot of crypto in the Cayman Islands. As a firm, we turn down maybe, I think they say about sort of 70% of approaches we get to set up sort of crypto companies, crypto mergers. There's a lot of companies out there that are very poorly governed. A lot of these companies are run by people who are very young and who have made their money very early through sort of speculation, and the governance just isn't there in what you see in sort of in other sort of sectors. So we expect to see more crypto work. There are some good crypto funds and mergers and companies out there, but there's a lot of bad ones.
Yeah, and I mean the swings in valuation are just so crazy. This is again just anecdotal, but my younger brother's an entrepreneur, who's done a bunch of different things in digital and media, and he did some consulting for a crypto business, for a couple of months, and they gave him, they wanted to pay him in crypto, and it was just sort of a fun little project. So he said, sure. And when he got the the agreement and sort of the matrix evaluations, I mean, the potential swing in what they were paying him was 10x. I mean, here he's doing this little 2-month project, and it could, and he understood. I mean, it could mean he worked for free, or it could mean he just got the fair hourly value of his service, or it could be that he made a wonderful investment. But I think from the point of view of a fiduciary winding down a business, that's a big challenge too. What do you do with those kinds of assets where you have those kinds of swings in value? Well, it's been an excellent discussion, and I'm very appreciative of everyone's contributions. I thought we would end just briefly with an update on the Revlon case. I think we spoke about it at an earlier meeting. This is the billion-dollar mistake made by Citibank. And briefly, what happened was there was a credit facility. It was being restructured. Citibank was the agent, and they needed to pay the interest current under the facility in order to do the debt exchange that was contemplated by the restructuring. And the problem for Citi was they had a somewhat antiquated processing system, which I certainly hope they've updated now. But the system wasn't able to process an out-of-cycle interest payment, right? I mean, they needed to calculate manually what the interest was through the date of the exchange, pay the interest, and do the exchange. Well, the only thing they could really find on their drop-down menu was just a complete payoff of the facility. So they put through an instruction for a payoff of the facility, and then they did like a special second instruction that pushed most of the money into an internal holding account and paid the interest. Well, you can guess what happened. You're trying to do this off-book solution to a complicated problem, and they ended up accidentally paying off the facility. And it was Revlon, which was maybe not a troubled credit, but a stressed credit, where the debt was maybe trading at 60 cents on the dollar. So, somebody had a very bad morning. They came in and they saw that $900 million had gone out the door, and they immediately sent out a clawback, and about 385 million of debt, gave the money back and said, yeah, we know this was a mistake. 500 million of debt said, you know what, we're keeping it. And the reason we're keeping it is New York has a rule called the discharge for value rule that says somebody pays off a mature debt, they don't get to change their mind. They just pay off the debt, and the lender gets to keep it. So this got everybody's attention a year and a half or 2 years ago or whatever it was, because Citibank went to court to try to recover the money, and they lost. The district court in New York held, sorry, the discharge for value rule works in New York, and you discharged the debt, and too bad, notify your insurance. Well, a few days ago, well, first of all, I should say that Citibank hired Neil Katyal, who I just think is maybe the best appellate lawyer in the world. And Katyal and his team appealed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and by an opinion handed down a couple of days ago, they won. And the Second Circuit overturned the decision, and Citibank's getting the money back. And what was interesting about it, other than just it's an unbelievable set of facts, is the Second Circuit applied and adopted what's basically an inquiry notice standard. They said, you know what? You get paid $500 million by a stressed company where the debt is trading at 60 cents on the dollar. and you get paid in full, you got to ask some questions. You're deemed to be on notice here, and you don't get to keep the money because anybody remotely paying attention to the market, the credit, the company would have at least said, did you mean to do this? So I thought that was a correct outcome. I thought it was a just result. I think it's a way of preserving the discharge for value rule, which I think is a good rule from a lender's perspective, but avoiding an unjust outcome and a real crazy windfall. The other reason for the Second Circuit's decision that I thought was interesting is they said, we're not going to apply discharge for value where the maturity date hasn't occurred. So you did calculate a maturity payoff, but this facility had 2 more years to run. So no fair claiming discharge for value rule under those circumstances. So just wanted to provide everybody an update on that. I think it's, I hope it's not going to need to be relevant for anybody just because these were such once in a lifetime kind of facts. But I think it is nice in a situation where, someone obviously makes a mistake and there's just a terrible, taking and a windfall, that appellate courts can still get it right in a way that's harmonious with the law. So I thought that was very good. We're at the top of the hour. So Smitha, anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, nothing from me. It was very
Yeah.
nice to meet everyone. Oh, I did have one more thing to add. I think something Tom said, I wanted to just, adds a level of assurance. It's been very quiet for us too. There's too much cheap money flowing into the system. Our government, like a lot of other governments, just wanted to avoid mass unemployment. So there was a lot of, so worker salaries are paid so that no one needed to get fired. So we have a lot of companies that were artificially propped up in the region. And what I find depressing about that is I feel that we've skipped past goal for restructuring and we'll just hit straight to liquidations for all of this. So that's, I guess, my main gripe about the COVID period. I think the government should have cut off the tap much sooner.
Interesting. Well, unprecedented times, and I feel like this next cycle, when we enter it, is going to be a fairly volatile and interesting one. So I think we all may not be quiet for much longer, would be my thought. I just also want to again thank Smitha for co-chairing with us. I think she's going to be terrific and brings a great perspective on all these issues. And I think it's great to have someone from Singapore in the chat, because it's I think it's such an interesting hub and a lot's going on there.